Peace and love, family. Welcome to another Read Book Club discussion. Tonight we are discussing chapter 4. Is it chapter 4? No, this is chapter 5. Yeah, chapter 5 of The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein. And you know who I am. I'm your host, Dr. Ma'at, and I have with me my big bro, Brother T. Wolo. Brother T, go ahead and introduce yourself to the listening audience.
Fam, how you doing? Once again, thank you so much for joining us for another Sunday. I'm Brother T. Looking forward to chop up chapter 5. Thank everybody who came in early to join us for this book club. Appreciate it, guys.
And so, family, take a moment out now to share this discussion. Share this discussion, family. Sharing is caring. Let's get the numbers up. Let's get the numbers up. Tonight, we're going to be talking about chapter 5, private agreements and government enforcement. All right. And so, yeah, this is going to be a dynamic discussion. Just want to salute some of the people in the building. Belinda Mace Johnson, peace and love to you, beloved. I see CJ Young Jr. He said, good evening, family. Hotep to you. Blockchain is in the building. Peace and power to you, Blockchain. Uh-oh. Got to shout out Morgan State University is in the building. Uh-oh. Hey, peace and love, Jennifer. This is a student. She's actually a current student of mine. And she's taking me for circuits. No, not circuits. This is signals and systems. And she read the book before, Brother T. So okay. I came in one day talking about the book. And I think I was talking about like public housing in the high rises in Baltimore and da. And so she said, Doc, it sounds like something out of the Color of Law. And I said, yeah. I said, that's the book we're reading for the book club. And she's like, oh, yeah. I read that book, you know. Awesome, and so awesome. I told her she got to check out The Color of Money. Color of Money. I told her that one was hot too by Darren. I told her she would love that, you know, because these books kind of complement one another. And so I just want to say, I want to shout her out. She said, good evening, everyone. She told me she was going to join us one day. I kept saying, you missed this. You missed the sessions. Dr. Bailey, I'm going to be there this Sunday. And so she's in the building. So peace to you, Jennifer. I see you. Peace to a beautiful mind. Says, peace and love, everyone. She said, don't forget to like and share the show. Please like and share the show, family. All right. I see Miss Old Lady is in the building. She said, greetings and peace, Sister Dr. Ma'at and Brother T. Thanks for all that you do. Ashe. Brother Shimsu Netch is in the building. He said, peace. Power to the people. I said peace to the people. Yeah, power to the people. Ashe and peace to Kerman Wingfield. He said strength and honor to everyone. Virgo Venom is in the building. Peace and love. Black power to you, Virgo Venom. She said black power, Dr. Mine and Brother T. Black love to the family in the chat. Ashe. Brother Ron Green is in the building. He said my Aunt Hotep to you. He said my Hotep family and Dr. Mott and Brother T. I see D. Light, he says, peace and blessings, Dr. Ma'at. Peace and love to you, brother. And Jennifer said, yes, looking forward to the discussion tonight. Thank you. Peace and love to everyone. I'm going to definitely drop the link in the chat so people can add their 2 cents. I know I haven't in the previous weeks, Brother T, because you and I would just go the whole 90 minutes. So I was like, I don't want to drop the link in the chat. And then it turned into a 3-hour show, you know. But I think tonight, you know, it would be kind of short because the chapter, you know, was really centered around, you know, racial covenants and just ways that white people would circumvent, you know, the racial covenants and how, again, it became illegal. But, you know, white folks think of inventive ways, creative ways to circumvent the law. And so the chapter kind of really focused on that, you know, and how the government was complicit in, you know, sanctioning these racial covenants or these deeds that have racial clauses. And so he gives a lot of examples of that and talks about how the FHH. And so I don't think that you and I would need, you know, the whole 90 minutes to talk about this particular chapter, because I think it was a lot of things were just made clear, to be honest with you, you know, in the chapter. So I'm definitely going to open up the lines, family, and drop the link in the chat for people to join. But I want to shout out Morgan. Our homecoming was yesterday, Brother T, and we lost. We usually do lose, and you know, we lose. So, but the score was tight this time. It was 21-24. We, you know, and so we lost by 3 points. Right, it was competitive. We gave them a run for their money, but we all knew that, you know, we were going to lose. And but I went to support the Morgan family and also to support 2 of my students who play in the band. I wanted to
Okay.
make sure, I supported them, and they saw me. We took a nice little selfie with each other. Took some selfies and stuff, and so did it up. And so shout out to Morgan. Saw a lot of former students, because a lot of the alumni, they come home for
Right. Right.
homecoming. And so it was a lot of love, Brother T. I was walking through the crowd. I'm in there just with my Morgan hoodie on. The alumni, we look ridiculous when we come through. The kids don't dress up. We come through with the Morgan hat, the Morgan
Uh-huh.
hoodie, Morgan jacket, Morgan shoes, Morgan socks, Morgan sweatpants, the Morgan flag. It's the alumni. We do all of that. The kids are
Right.
like, the students, they're like, whatever. They come
Right.
through just looking regular. But the alumni, we always gotta overdo it, And so I was definitely that. I was Morgan down to my socks. Morgan down to my socks. So I
I
went through
feel you.
there, and so saw a lot of former students, a lot of love. Dr. Bailey, Dr. Bailey, Dr. Bailey, So it was just a lot of love. And
So
I just a lot of them are doing well. They've graduated and they're working, they're out in the world. And so I'm super proud of those students. Also, Brother T, before we get started with the comments, I wanted to shout out my aunt. I went past, my aunt had a dinner party for my uncle. He celebrated his birthday a couple of days ago. And so the family gathered around 3:00 to just, celebrate him and celebrate his life. And so we, had a really good time. And so my aunt said, well, I was in the store looking at cards. I saw a card and I thought about you. And so this was the beautiful card, Brother T, that
okay.
she gave me. And she says, color of your skin, content of your character, both on point. Both
Wow.
on point. And Brother T, that meant a lot to me. I pride myself in my character, Brother T. I'd be like, I'm working on my character. I'm trying, but it's like, is when the elders, in the
Hmm.
family notice
Yeah.
stuff. Like you may think that you're working on things, but it's when the elders step up and say, you know what? This is what I see. I see you. I really appreciated that. It says color of your skin.
Yeah.
And she was the one who always, I never felt any type of way about being a dark-skinned woman because of
Hmm.
my aunt. My aunt is a beautiful chocolate woman. And
Hmm.
when I was younger, let me recant that. I did feel some type of way because, of course, in the Black community, colorism is very prevalent. But she
Prevalent.
was the aunt that validated my beauty. She was like, no, you are beautiful. You are dark and
Mm.
lovely and beautiful. You are Black and beautiful. And so after my aunt, I went to her. I was feeling some type of way about being a dark skinned woman. This is
Hmm.
girl, because I was a young girl at the time. This was the
Right.
aunt that said, "Oh no, you are beautiful." So I never needed outsiders to validate my beauty because she did it. My Uncle
Mm.
Melvin did it. You a beautiful Black queen. So I didn't need society or a man. You get what I'm saying, Brother T, or
Right.
other out to validate that. Because right inside of the family, my beauty and my intellect was validated. So anyway, this same aunt, not only did she validate my complexion, it made me feel extremely beautiful for
Hmm.
just being chocolate. Now she said, look, the content of your character is
Mm.
on point, and
Everything's
then
aligned. Everything's
yeah,
aligning.
everything is alive, Brother T. And so she goes on to say, she said, you wear your melanin in your crown and you own your resilience, your pride, and your love for your people. She said, your
Mm.
Black is so beautiful. And she said, I thought of you when I read this card. She love
Awesome.
Auntie. And so, Brother T, I said, Auntie, when I go live, I gotta talk about this. She said, you
That's
gonna
big.
go live, and when you talk, you gonna. I said, Auntie, I'm going to talk about it. I said, I'm gonna talk about it because this was just a phenomenal card, and I'm gonna put it right here on my
Hmm.
desk, Brother T. But I just wanted to shout out my auntie for that lovely card.
Got to
So
give auntie love. I think it's important for family and our community to reinforce who we are when we're
absolutely,
young, because that reinforcement we become when we older and we remember. So if it wasn't for that reinforcement from your family, from your village, from your community, would there be a Dr. Ma'at? So,
come on,
so
T.
we have to remember that it's important to put that into the children, to understand that they are everything, that they're enough, that they're beautiful, that they're smart, that they can do what needs to be done. I don't think if you didn't have that feel that fulfillment in your community, in your village, I don't think you could become who you are, because look, your mother's an educator, you're
That's
an
a
educator. Your mother proclaimed power. You proclaim everything with power. You had it all around you, and I've been around your village, so I understand how close knit it is and how
Absolutely.
everyone reflects that light. So, shout out to for Auntie for that.
Yeah, Ashe. And thank you so much for that, big bro. Like, you're so right. We got to make sure that we pour into the youth in our family. You just never know how you would just saying certain things, how that impacts people, the
Hmm.
youth in your family, even the youth in the community, how that impacts them, later on. So, I'm wearing my hoodie today, flexing in my complexion. I'm
I know that's
rocking my hoodie today, for all my dark skinned sisters out there. But Brother T, go ahead
right.
and get into the comment, because you said there were a couple of comments you wanted to address from the last discussion.
Yes, last week we just started reading comments, and one thing I love when we open up this discussion tonight is seeing some familiar faces. A beautiful mind. I can bet my bottom dollar that a beautiful mind is going to be in the chat. Ron Green, Virgo Venom, D Light, Shemsu, a lot of people coming here, and we can bet that they're going to be here, and that gives us energy and gives us the ability to have the discussion. But one thing I love to do as well is go back to the past week and see who exactly comes in to leave a comment. I don't want to leave them out as well, because some people come watch the discussion on replay. So we
Right.
want to definitely give those soldiers a shout out as well. P.
Absolutely.
Wells stated that I saw one of those black long redlining walls when he was a kid in Brooklyn, New
Mm,
York City.
mm.
He remembered wondering how weird the wall looked because it looked out of place. Now I know why. So it's important, you know, for people to come to this discussion, because now they can put the dots together. They can connect the dots to see exactly why things were done. What we did in the past comes in light if we only take the time out to do the research. So P. Wells, he found that out why the walls were put up in his community. He didn't know, but with the discussion of last week, understanding how they separated, he found out, right? Then
Absolutely.
we have another comment from Bronx, NYC.
Mm.
Black ownership is low due to the politics, with banks not giving out loans to African Americans. Without a doubt, racism plays a major role. We all know this. Learn, let's keep it 100. So he stated the obvious. Sometimes when we make the comments, they're right on point to what we read. So when I read that,
Absolutely.
it made me think that, okay, he definitely understood exactly what we was trying to put out, what we tried to explain with the works of Richard Rothstein. And his point, politics played a big point of this, and we have to understand. But sometimes it's the obvious. What we're starting to do with this chapter, with these chapters, is basically point to the politics, point to the policies, point to the ordinances,
Come
point
on.
to the people who was responsible, so we can speak more intelligently about the issue, and we can fix the issue to make sure we never see the issue again. So this is exactly what these chapters do. We pointing out the specific thing so we can talk about it and look at it and research it for ourselves to make sure it's valid.
Speak your
So that's the
speech.
point.
Speak your speech. Speak.
I just had to
so
say that.
So that's an important thing that we sometimes we speak in general, but we need specific points in order to bring light to it, because we have the people out there who are the naysayers. And if we don't have these points and dates and places and people to speak to them, our point can be put at bay. It won't be validated. So that's the importance of these chapters, and I appreciate everyone who takes the time out to listen. And it goes to tell me how many of our children, our teenagers out there listening as well. I want to shout out Maya. She says every week she looks forward. She looks forward to hear have a black-tastic week, have a black-tastic day. Now, she's sharing this with her relatives. She's sharing it with her schoolmates. She's sharing it with people that she meets on the street.
It's a
So
high school student. I want you to point that out. I don't know if you said that.
a
This is
high
a
school
high school
student.
student.
So
Hmm.
when you say certain things, when we speak as adults, we don't know who we may affect, who we may motivate. So I just want to give that shout out. Last week we also remember Brother Jalen said, tell the group to say hello, to do the discussion. So when we have these children, our teenagers, our youth out here listening to these discussions, they're that much wiser. Shout out to the Morgan grad student as well, because now we have our middle school, our high school, and our collegiate brothers and sisters listening. So we are sure that we are teaching them. They're learning and they're picking up what we're trying to put down. So this is what I wanted to relay during this moment.
Absolutely, brother T. That was everything you said was just so powerful. Like you said, the racism. I'm just going back to what you said, and just to reiterate, you said we know that home ownership was low in the Black community due to racism, but you're
Mm-hmm.
saying that we have to be specific when we talk about it, right? We got to be able to intelligently point to, okay, the people, the administrations, and the policies that
Mm-hmm.
that created low home ownership in the Black community. We can't run around here and say we want reparations because of racism and slavery, and
Right.
can't speak and can't point to, like you said, people, administrations, and policies. We have to be specific and have to be able to have an intelligent conversation. Well, when did you all experience this? What
Right.
happened? Why? Who are the major players? So we got to be able to have these intelligent conversations, and that is exactly what this book and this book club affords us to do. And so,
Right.
brother T, let's jump into chapter 5.
What's up?
I always want you to start it off,
this
set it off.
chapter. This chapter was about private agreements, government enforcement. One way that we found out from previous chapters that we read in this book is that how when things were written down in policies and it was enforced by the state, sometimes the federal government put the remedy, but it wasn't enforced. And I found out in this chapter that the private agreements were their way to still restrict us from what was created in neighborhoods and keeping us out of neighborhoods. It was the private agreements. It made me realize that they would even try to restrict us from living in houses, even though they were getting federally funded. So they learned, because you can go fast forward to 2022,
Come
they
on.
learned all I have to do is not receive federal funding, keep my contracts private, and I can run this how I wish. So they, over the years, they have developed another plan. But in this chapter, they talk about the private agreements and how the Supreme Courts of their state could not enforce any wrongdoings or fix any wrongdoings because it was private agreements. It's something in our Constitution about writing private contracts that they can't deal with. Let me make an example of something we may know that we can put something in the face. A lot of us think that there's freedom of speech on the social media platform. So first time that we are violated, we said, that's my First Amendment right, freedom of speech. Sorry to say, I'm sorry to inform you that there's no freedom of speech on a social media platform because you have a contract with this platform. And the platform says they have the right to terminate your account if you break or breach their contract.
Come on, T, teach.
So because it's a private contract, it doesn't have to do with the First Amendment that we have federally and have to abide by the state. So this right here is right, terms and conditions, Ms. Lamb, you're absolutely correct. So this private agreement was based off that Constitution, and they could not enforce the 14th Amendment until they made it federal and state law and then able to enforce it. So I wanted to make that point before we went on. So on chapter 5, on page 77, I highlighted in the mid 20th century, many urban neighborhoods were already racially exclusive, which we discussed. Property owners and builders had created segregated environments by including language both in individual home deeds and in pacts among neighbors that prohibited future resales to African Americans. In this page, it talked about how property owners and builders made sure before they build, they put in writing, okay, this establishment cannot be for we cannot sell it for to African Americans. We cannot have African Americans move in this community. So this was how they did it. They did it not just the houses that were already created. They put this restriction in houses that they were planning to build. They wanted to make sure that they kept the property value of the house of that development intact. And they believed by putting African Americans in there, it decreased the value. So they made sure that they wrote those restrictive rules inside of the contract. So once again, a contract, not private yet, but just a contract letting them know that they had enforcement with the government that, hey, this no African American tenants can live in this establishment. So this is before the FHA.
Right.
Okay, that's on page 77. Dr. Mott, you want to add on to that?
Oh yeah. I mean, I think that was a beautiful. Actually, in this first page, he summarizes the chapter,
Yeah.
right? And so, like you said, you had property owners and builders. They created these segregated environments, by creating these home deeds, right, and pacts amongst each other. Okay, and it says that later on, the FHA actually adopted their theories that one, they were convinced that racial exclusion would enhance their property values, and two, that the deeds, these racial deeds or deeds with racial clauses, were mere
Mm-hmm.
private agreements that would not run afoul of the constitutional prohibitions, right? So it wouldn't violate the Constitution. So he goes on to say, but when the Supreme Court ruled in 1948, and we're going to get into that later on, in 1948, that racial clauses in deeds and mutual agreements, if truly private, could not depend on the power of the government to enforce them. It says the FHA and other federal agencies evaded and subverted the ruling, preserving state sponsored segregation at least for another decade. That's literally, this one page summarized the entire chapter, because that's what happened. And so then we move on, to section 1, where he talks about, like you said earlier, T, that as early as the 19th century. So we're talking about even in the 1800s, right? That people created deeds, okay, deeds to keep Black folks out. And so at the beginning, it says as early as the 19th century, deeds in Brookland, Massachusetts, forbade resale of property to any Negro or native of Ireland. So remember, the Irish were treated like we were treated. I don't want to say exactly, right? But they were treated like the white Negroes, you know what I mean? And
Right,
so it said, yeah, in the beginning. So it says, right, as early as the 1800s, they had these deeds. And so it says the preferred means to evade the Supreme Court's 1917 Buchanan racial zoning decision. So we got to remember, family, initially they had these zoning rules or zoning ordinances, these racial zoning rules and zoning ordinances. And then in 1917, the Buchanan decision, I think it was the Supreme Court who ruled that, wait a minute, these zoning ordinances or rules are unconstitutional. So then the white folks said, okay, we'll try to figure out another means to keep it all white. That's why I named today's title, Brother T, All White by Any Means Necessary. So the white folks said, okay, it's against the law, it's unconstitutional for us to zone or create zoning rules and zoning ordinances based on race. Well, this is what we're going to do to evade the law.
Mm-hmm.
Now we're going to zone based on whether the area is meant for commercial or industrial purposes or residential purposes, right? Or single family residences. And what they did was they zoned all of the white communities for single family residences and zoned the Black communities for commercial and industrial. So we wonder why, Brother T, white folks, as I gave this example last week, while white folks were able to build a highway through one of the Black communities, Haiti, or T, put pollution centers and businesses in the black community. Why in the black community you see bars, you see a lot of
Right.
the outlets, you see the bars, you see the red light district, all of those different things in the black community, corner stores, because those areas are zoned for commercial and industrial purposes. And so
Mm-hmm.
anyway, that's what they did. But that wasn't enough to keep black middle class families out. So just zoning according to purpose, family family residence, industrial, commercial, that wasn't enough to keep black middle class families out. So
Right.
now here comes the deeds, brother T. Here comes the
Mm-hmm.
racial deeds, the racial covenants. Okay. And so these racial covenants were formed, as it says, as early as the 19th century. Okay. And it says the deed clauses were part of what were commonly termed restrictive covenants. Okay. And there's a list of obligations that purchasers of property must assume. So it says for the first half of the 20th century, okay, one common commitment, in this long list was a promise to never sell to African Americans. And so they would use language at the bottom of 78. They would use language, and it gives this whole paragraph, but at the end of the paragraph, it says right here that bop, 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 it shall suitably screen, no pay, bop, 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 cemetery, place of burial, or for any structure other than a dwelling for people of the Caucasian race. This is what the deeds would say. So it'll be a clause in there that's basically saying, look, you can't do this with your property. It's a long list of things you can't do. But inside of that list, it says right here that you can't use it for any other structure. It says other than a dwelling for people of the Caucasian race. So then, Brother T, remember, there was some white folks that said, well, wait a minute, I have domestic workers. I have domestic servants. We're talking about, the early 1900s when black folks, they were the only jobs, Brother T, that we had was either agricultural or domestic. And so there were people that said, well, wait a minute, man, I hear what you're saying, but what about my domestic worker? I have a domestic worker who lives with me. So we need to modify this. And so they went on to say, now, okay, then they added, except in the capacity of a servant, domestic employed thereon as such by, I'm sorry, it says thereon? Employed thereon, yes, as such by a white Caucasian owner, tenant, or occupant. So they went on to modify the clause. So first it was, look, if you're white, if you're of the Caucasian race, if you're not, you can't live here. We can't rent this to you. You can't live here. You can't buy the property. And then they went on to say, well, wait a minute, we got to modify this because some of us have domestic workers or servants who live with us. So that's why it goes on to say, except in the capacity of a servant or domestic employee thereon as such by a white Caucasian owner, tenant, or occupant. So then they go on to say this, though. Hold on. The effectiveness of a house deed that contained a racial covenant was limited. However, if a white family sold property to an African American, it was difficult for a neighbor to establish standing in court to reverse the sale and have the black family evicted because the covenant was a contract between the present owner, right, and the previous owner. So they couldn't take it to court. So then what they end up doing, Brother T, these white folks always figure it out. We got to keep it white. So they said, okay, it won't hold up in court. So then what we'll do is we will create a racial covenant amongst neighbors, and all of us will sign this, right? And so if someone violates this, then we'll be able to sue the neighbor. So that was the next best thing, right? So it says,
Neighborhood associations.
come on, Brother T. So look, so increasingly in the 20th century, racial covenants took the form of a contract among all owners in the neighborhood. Under these conditions, a neighbor could sue if an African American family made a purchase. So, like you said, Brother T, go ahead and take it from there. We get into the community associations in the next paragraph.
Well, that right there was that was the point that I wanted to read when you had the effectiveness of the house deed. It
That's
just
right.
shows you that they are adamant and they persevere till they get exactly what they want. They realized that there was limitations to every way from the ordinances, realized that was unconstitutional, then the private agreement with seller and buyer, and they said, okay, golly, that right has that has limitations. And then they said, you know what? If we have a commitment of all sellers, and then so we can now, as neighbors, can send them to court and fight them to keep this all white. Now, how can we do that? By creating an association. So I'm trying to find now. I didn't highlight exactly when that
I
started.
have it. It's right in. It's right in the beginning. It's
Okay.
right in
Okay.
the end. At the page it says to get around this problem, many subdivision developers
Got it.
created a community. Yeah, you want to take it?
Yeah, cool. So it
Okay.
says to get around this problem, many subdivision developers created a community association before putting homes up for initial sale, and they made membership in it a condition of purchase. Association bylaws usually included a whites only clause. In the 1920s, this tactic gained national prominence when developer J.C. Nicholas constructed the Country Club District of Kansas City, which included 6,000 homes, 160 apartment buildings, and 35,000 residents. Nicholas required each purchaser to join the district association. Not only did its rules prohibit sales or rentals to black families, but this racial exclusion policy could not be modified without assent of owners of a majority of the development acreage. That's powerful. They realize that they can use this model to restrict completely any black sale of ownership or rental. And we wonder how our ancestors, how our elders was wiped out of wealth, of ownership from this country. Knowing that home ownership is one of the fastest and best ways to gain wealth. If you can't get it from your earnings from work, you can definitely get it from the equity you build in your home. So when we look at this stuff like this, how they restricted, how they removed that opportunity from our elders, they said, let's form these associations. Now, all homeowners have heard of associations,
Yeah, I'm a
but did
part
they
of one.
know? We know, because what do these associations do? They keep the certain rules and regulations in line in the neighborhood, correct? But how many of us knew that these associations started and were created to
Come
keep
on.
us out?
Come on.
So,
That's what it was.
so
That's what it was
to
about.
keep
Come
us
on,
out.
T.
So we have to be aware of how the origin of things, and this is a perfect point to bring up. These associations was the noose that tightened up around our economic inclusion, a way that they could keep us out. They had to find a way to tighten up the plan. When they found that a way that it was limited, they found a way to tighten it up. If you couldn't make it a commitment between two people, you had to make it a commitment between three. When that didn't work, you know what? Add the whole neighborhood. And this just tells you how far it would go to keep us away from being included.
That's a fact. That's a fact, brother T. And so, like you said, that's the origin of homeowners association. And so, anybody who's purchased a house know that when you purchase a house, in a neighborhood, typically, well, I know the neighborhood I'm in. I had to join the homeowners association. We got to pay monthly fees. It's like $35 a month that you got to pay. They have bylaws. It's certain things you can and not can and cannot do. With your property. To make sure that the look of the neighborhood, remains, on a certain level, right? Remains. So certain things you can't do, certain things you can't add, to your home because they want to make sure the look of the neighborhood is consistent and remains
Right.
of high quality, right? And so, yeah, but I had no idea, Brother T, until I read this chapter earlier that the
Right.
purpose of these, they called them then community association, but today we call them homeowner association, the HOA. But I had no idea that they were started at the origin or the purpose of these associations were meant to keep black folks out. And so, as Brother T stated, after that guy, what's his name, J.C. Nicholson, after he constructed the
Yeah.
Country Club, then it became a model for everybody, right? New York did it. I'm just going to keep on going. New York,
Mhm.
New York City. It says, for example, a survey of 300 developments were built between 1935 and 1947 in Queens and Nassau and in Westchester counties. They found that 56% of them had racially restrictive covenants. It says of the larger subdivision, okay, 85% of them had racially restrictive covenants. He moves on to talk about Chicago. It says by 1945, an estimate 175 Chicago neighborhood associations were enforcing deeds that barred sales or rentals to African Americans. By 1947, you had half of the city's residential area outside its African American areas had such deeds restriction. In Detroit, shout out the brother Shimsu who's in the building. In Detroit, from 1943 to 1965, it says white homeowners, real estate agents, or developers organized 192 associations to preserve, racial exclusion. So everybody was complicit. It was not only the people who buying the houses, the real estate agents, right?
Yes.
The developers themselves, everybody was complicit in making sure that they keep it all white. Everybody.
Mhm.
All right. So moving in, it says the Great Plains. Okay. The Oklahoma Supreme Court in 1942 not only voided an African American's purchase of a property that was restricted by a racial covenant, it says it charged them for all court costs and attorney's fees, including those incurred by the damn white seller, Brother T. So it went
Mm.
all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, Oklahoma Supreme Court, and they said, oh, well, yeah, we're siding with them. So it says between 1935 and 1945, this is what stuck out to me. It says W.E. Boeing, the founder of Boeing Aircraft, developed suburbs in north of Seattle, right? During this period after World War II, the South Seattle Land Company, all right, the Puget Mill Company, and others constructed more suburbs. These builders all wrote racially restrictive language into their deeds. The result was a city whose African American population was encircled by all white suburbs. I want to say this, Brother T. What stuck out to me was this when I read W.E. Boeing. A lot of my students, and I tell them this at Morgan, I say, when you get your degree, right? I always encourage my students to create, to build for themselves. I always
Mhm.
tell them there's nothing wrong with going out here doing some internships, getting your feet wet, and networking with folks. But what I want you to be, and what I'm encouraging you to be, is to be an engineer for Black people, meaning that you take your expertise and you come back to the Black community and you solve the problems in our community. You want to
Mhm.
go and work for Boeing, but Boeing is the same company whose founder didn't want to even create a suburb for, locked you out, locked your ancestors out. But yet you want to strive. Come on, Brother T. But yet you want to go and work for Boeing. Hold up. You want to go work for J.P. Chase and Morgan? Those people who were invested in the slave trade? So I
Mhm.
tell my students this so that when you're going out here and you're lending your labor to
Right.
people, know who you're lending your labor to. So
Two.
anyway, that's why this particular paragraph stuck out to me, because a lot of students, oh, Dr. Bailey, I got a $90,000 offer from Boeing. Oh, the same guy that didn't want your ancestors to live in the suburbs that he developed. You want to go lend your labor to them.
Mhm.
So see, Brother T, we sit here and we complain about racism and white supremacy, but then we groom our children to go and support the same damn system, the same system,
Ooh.
Brother T, that got their foot on our necks. The same
Mm.
system. All right, Brother T,
Ooh.
I'm gonna get off. I'm gonna get off of it, Brother T.
Whoa.
So look, I'm gonna get off of it, Brother T. I'm gonna get off. I'm gonna get off,
Ooh.
Brother T. So he goes on to talk about Oakland, California, DeWitt, Birkingham. It says, who was
Mhm.
a respected African American physician. They said he tried to buy a daggone place in Berkeley, right? It says,
Mhm.
okay, so someone actually sold him a home. A white boy sold him a home
Right.
in Berkeley. And anybody know about California, Berkeley? When I went over there, my cousins and them, they live in like Oakland,
Okay.
Oakland and Haywood in that area. And so when she took me to Berkeley, you see a lot of white hippies out there now. You know,
Mhm.
everybody's like a white hippie, but it's a white neighborhood. And so
Yeah.
anyway, so this brother, tried to buy a home. It says this was during, he was a medic. He was a captain in the army and a medical corps during World War II. And after the war, it says he established a medical practice serving the city's African American community in 1955. A white friend purchased and resold a home to him in
Mhm.
Claremont, Berkeley, right? It says where a lot of university and California professors and administrators live. But it says when the identity of the true buyer became known, what happened? The state ordered this brother to vacate the residence. And that's what happened, Brother T, to a lot of our brothers and sisters who bought properties in white neighborhoods. They kicked them out.
That's
They
right.
kicked them out, and then they also penalized the white person who sold the property to them. So moving on, I'm going to finish this up and I'm going to throw it to you. It says in LA, in Los Angeles from 1937 to 1948, right? It says
Mhm.
more than 100 lawsuits sought to
Mhm.
enforce restrictions by having African Americans evicted from their homes. In a 1947 case, an African American man was actually jailed for refusing to move out of his house he purchased in violation of a covenant. Then it says Westwood neighborhood bordering the Los Angeles campus of the University of California, that was segregated. And what the students came up with, Brother T, was this cooperative housing association.
Right.
And so they required each student to basically do some domestic work so that all of the students will be considered domestic servants. So that way, an African American could live, in that particular, house or residence. But they said that didn't last long, Brother T. It said it says, however, this gimmick did nothing to desegregate Westwood generally. So, in this particular neighborhood, they, some students tried to get around it, do this cooperative housing thing and wanted everybody to cook and clean to be considered domestic servants so that an African American student were able to, join in. But it says that the gimmick really did nothing to desegregate the neighborhood. And so moving into section 2, Brother T, do you want to take it at the top of 82? You're muted,
Yes,
Brother
I
T.
want
Okay.
to. Just everything you stated just can be verified because these are court cases. One thing I want to drive home to our chat is that all these things can be verified because actual court cases. And once again, when we have the conversation, and when people say, "Oh, the government wasn't involved," we never was evicted. These things can be proven, and you just laid out the time frame from 1937 to 1948. As we go on in section 2, on page 81, they go in deeper about how the government was definitely involved in this whole thing. So it says government at all levels became involved in promoting and enforcing the restrictive covenants. Okay. Throughout the nation, courts ordered African Americans to be evicted from homes that they had purchased. They came
Mm.
up with the money. And I remember before you had to come up with half 50% of the house cost, and then you was also charged a very large interest rate. So you telling me these African Americans found the money to pay that 50% and also had to be charged this large interest, and they would still put out their house because of these covenants. So the government at all levels became involved in promoting and enforcing the restrictive covenants. Throughout the nation, courts ordered African Americans evicted from homes they had purchased. State Supreme Courts upheld the practice when it was challenged. In Alabama, California, Colorado, Kansas, Kentucky, Louisiana, Maryland, Michigan, Missouri, New York, and North Carolina, West Virginia, and Wisconsin. So it was everywhere. So, in many hundreds of such cases, judges endorsed the view that restrictive covenants did not violate the Constitution because they were private agreements. The power
Mm-hmm.
of these private agreements. They found out they used the Constitution to their advantage. So remember, they say follow the paperwork.
That's
You better
right.
follow. You better follow the paperwork because these things are very, very important for us to understand exactly how they can limit our involvement. So it says that local governments aggressively promoted such covenants, undermining any notion that they were purely private instruments. For example, following the 1917 Buchanan decision, the mayor of Baltimore
Ah,
organized an official committee of segregation.
brother T, as soon as
Baltimore.
I saw it, I said, Baltimore, here we go.
No,
I said, have we
our,
ever been known for anything positive? Have we ever been
no.
known?
Our elders used to say, Baltimore, don't get it twisted, is a very
Ah,
segregated and racially motivated town. You know what I'm saying? A city. So we have to remember that, hey, a lot of racist things was done here as well. And we're going to definitely cite this, put a bookmark in it, and make sure it never happens again.
come
And
on.
also, we have to because it's happened where we live. So it says that following this 1970 Buchanan decision, the mayor of Baltimore organized an official committee of segregation led by the city's chief legal officer. One of the committee's activities was to organize and support neighborhood associations, that would adopt such agreement. So they supported it. The mayor said, "Hey, what are these agreements? These covenants? These restrictions? We're going to support them." So even it showed that every area from federal into local supported restrictive these restrictive covenants. So it goes on to page 82 a little further. The most powerful endorsement, however, came from states of
Mm-hmm.
municipalities, but from the federal government. So it
Mm-hmm.
says not just the states, but the federal government made sure that they held tight. So in 1926, the same year that the U.S. Supreme Court upheld exclusionary zoning, it also upheld restrictive covenants, finding that they were voluntary private contracts, not state actions. With this decision to rely upon, successive presidential administrations embraced covenants as a mean of segregating the nation. So when once again they made sure that they protected these private contracts, even though they were restrictive from the federal and state um, government.
All
Dr.
right.
Mike, you want to go?
Yeah. So, and then at the bottom of page 82, Brother T, I wanted to talk about how they started changing, the language a little bit. You know, how like they won't flat out and say, we don't want black folks around here. They just use certain language to make sure that they
Mhm.
restrict us. So it says that as President Hoover's 1931 conference on home ownership, Harlan Bartholomew, his committee on planning subdivisions recommended that all new neighborhoods should have appropriate restrictions. And they couldn't say, Brother T, they couldn't flat out say, I mean, because we talking about, look at this, it's the president's, right? President Hoover's conference on home ownership. So they couldn't flat out say, we don't want black folks. When you form these neighborhoods, make sure you keep niggas out. Make sure you keep those Negroes out, right? They couldn't flat out say that. So they just said, make sure that you have appropriate restrictions. And then when people say, well, what are those appropriate restrictions? They said, we're going to refer you to the 1926 review. And in the 1926 review, they gloated on how they were able to maintain property values by keeping black folks out using racial clauses and deeds. And so that's what they pointed them to. So they didn't flat out say, you know, when you form these new neighborhoods, if you want to keep your property values high, you're gonna have to keep black folks out. What they did was point and said, "Well, I want you to check out." Somebody said, "Well, what do you mean by appropriate restrictions?" He pointed to the 1926 review, right? And it says the document showing that 38 of 40 recently constructed developments barred sale to or occupancy by African Americans. The review observed that racial exclusion clauses were, in quotes, in rather general use in the vicinity of the larger eastern and northern cities, which have experienced an influx of colored people in recent years. These prohibitions, I'm sorry, it explained, benefited both the developer, right? The developer and the owner. Okay. And so they're encouraging racial exclusion, okay, in this particular review. So they go on to say, what is remarkable about the assurance was its acknowledgement that any government involvement in segregation could violate the Constitution. So they were very careful. Okay. So they go on to talk about the indirection. So meaning that he didn't say, you know, don't let black folks in it, in here. But what he did was say, well, you need to adopt appropriate restriction and point to a 1926 review where they promoted, racial exclusion. So he says this indirection could not mask the federal government took a step toward involvement when the conference report adopted a recommendation that appropriate, in quotes, rules for new subdivision included racial exclusion. It remained, however, for the Franklin D. Roosevelt administration to turn this recommendation into a requirement. So basically, Brother T, again, they said, hey, you need to adopt appropriate restrictions and point to the 1926 review. He's basically saying that this indirection, we can't say that the federal government wasn't complicit, right? Because even though they didn't explicitly or specifically say, leave them Negroes out, they pointed to a 1926 review, which did. All right. So he moves on and now talking about the FHA. And for those who are just joining us, the FHA is the Fair Housing Administration, right? Federal housing. Is it fair or federal? Federal, right? Unmute T. Federal, right? Okay. Federal
Fair.
housing. Is it fair or federal? The FHA.
It's fair.
Okay, I'm making sure, just making sure. So Fair Housing Act. All right. Oh, Fair Housing. No, I said Fair Housing Act. That's different, Brother T. FHA is Fair Housing Administration. Let me look at that. Tell me in the chat, y'all. Is it fair? You sure it's fair and not federal? Fair housing.
I'm looking right now. Because I'm getting brain fog. I wasn't even thinking about that.
I am, because I'm thinking about the FHA. I'm thinking about the FHA. But it's the it's the federal. It's federal. It's federal. It's not Fair Housing Act. That came later. This was the federal housing.
You caught me by surprise.
This is
I'm trying to find my next point.
Look. This is the Federal Housing Act, right? And for those who are just joining us, yep, the FHA, the Federal Housing Administration. Remember, they created this FHA to help people buy houses. Basically, they ain't even people, it's to help white people buy houses by actually insuring the loans, right? So the Federal Housing Administration. So it says from the beginning, and thank you so much. Everybody in the chat said it's federal. No, it's not Federal Home. He said Federal Homeowners Association. No, it's Federal Housing Administration. Thank you, Shimsu. Shimsu said it's Federal Housing Administration. So it says from the FHA beginning, from the FHA's beginning, its appraisers not only gave high ratings to mortgage applications if there were no African Americans living in it or nearby the neighborhood, but they also lowered their risk estimates for individual properties with restrictive deed language. So it was an incentive for white people to include, racial clauses in their deeds, right? To form racial covenants. They were incentivized to do this, Brother T, just like white flight is incentivized, but we'll get to that next chapter. So there were incentives. One, if we keep our neighborhood all white, that's why I called this all white by any means necessary. If we keep the neighborhood all white, then we're going to get high FHA ratings, which means that they're going to back these mortgages, right? We'll be able to go to banks and get mortgages and buy properties. And we need to also include, because we're going to get a lower risk, right? A lower risk estimates when we put restrictive deed language, right, into our deeds, restrictive language into our deeds. And so going on to page 84, it says the 1936 manual, this is for the FHA, summarized instructions to the appraisers like this. In section 284-2, he says carefully compile zoning regulations are the most effective because they not only exercise control over the subject property, but also over the surrounding area. However, they are seldom complete enough to assure homogeneous or harmonious a neighborhood. So basically, they're saying zoning regulations are cool, right? But it's not going to guarantee that we keep this thing all white, right? That we keep it all the same, that we keep it homogeneous, right? So what do we need to do? Well, section 84.3 says recorded deed restrictions should strengthen and supplement zoning ordinances. Recommended restrictions include prohibition of the occupancy of properties except by the race for which they are intended, right? And appropriate provisions for enforcement. And by appropriate provisions for enforcement, the FHA meant the right of a neighbor to seek a court order for the violation of an African American purchaser or renter. And so he goes on to give all of these examples, Brother T, in California. I'm looking through it. In California, in St. Louis. Do you see the other states, in any other places? I see California, I see St. Louis, where the FHA said we're not going to insure this loan. Some black folks who live there, we're not going to insure it. So these are the different examples that they gave us. So at the bottom, I'm on page 85, right above section 4. It says in the FHA's finance program, a production builder who gained pre-approval for loans frequently inserted language in property deeds which preambles, such as whereas the Federal Housing Administration requires that the existing mortgages on the said premises be subject and subordinated to the said restrictions. And when the VA began to guarantee mortgages after World War II, it also recommended and frequently demanded that properties with VA mortgages have racial covenants in their deeds. So again, I just want to reiterate, Brother T, that everybody was complicit in this. It was the government all the way to the Supreme Court, state governments, local agencies, builders, real estate agents, appraisers, owners. Everyone was complicit in making sure they kept everything all white by any means necessary. Go ahead, Brother T.
It's just amazing because once we was reading The Color of Money, one of the Latin books that we've read, they talked about after World War II when the soldiers had the GI Bill, FHA, came and they was buying homes. I never understood at that point of reading that book how restrictive they were. Now we heard of white only neighborhoods and we thinking, hey, it's only because we did not want to live there. And remember, they had politicians who wanted to preach the point, blacks just like to be with themselves. They don't want to be integrated in our communities. Not knowing they went as deep to put restrictive measures into place. So when our elders fought in World War II, and also the birth of the suburbs were created because whites had the ability to take these loans and then go and to buy new homes in these new suburbs. I never knew about the restrictive measures that it ran so deep. Maybe certain communities, but this book has pointed out that it's from all the way to the Supreme Court. And that goes on to what we'll be talking about on page 85 and in the next segment. It says, unless you wanted to go on, Dr. Ma, and make some more points. You're muted.
No, I said, go ahead, Brother T. I said, we almost finished. We're rolling. Go ahead, Brother T.
So when we go on, we realize how deep this went. We said then the Supreme Court issued a ruling. There was much of an upheaval for housing policy versus Brown for housing policy, as Brown versus Board of Education would be. 6 years later, for education. In 1948, the court reputed its 1926 endorsement of restrictive covenants and acknowledged that enforcement by state courts was unconstitutional. It was one thing. The court ruled Shelley versus Kramer for private individuals to discriminate, but deeds that barred sales to African Americans could be effective only if the state courts enforced them. So that's deep. So, but the deeds that barred sales to African Americans could be effective only if the state courts enforced them. So even though the Supreme Court set precedent with Shelley versus Kramer, they like, hey, if it's not all online, then we can't do anything about it. We can enforce it federally, but it also has to be enforced by the state. So it says here, but the deeds that barred sales to African Americans could be effective only if the state courts enforced them by ordering black families to vacate homes purchased in white neighborhoods. Racial covenants power depended on the collaboration of the judicial system. It had to be through collaboration of the judicial system, and as such violated the 14th Amendment, which prohibits the state government from participating in segregation. So the court, in companion case, decided on the same day, also banned the use of federal courts to enforce covenants in federal territory like Washington, D.C. So a logical consequence of this decision was that if it complicity in racial discrimination by federal courts constituted a de jure segregation, then surely discrimination by executive branch agencies like the FHA also did. So they're showing you that it had to be in tandem, which is a shame. You would think that if it was federally, the highest law of the land, supposedly, right, it's supposed to be said all. But they said, hey, if the state don't coincide with us, hey, you got to listen to the state. So if they want to vacate you, they're going to vacate you. And no matter what the 14th Amendment says, you got to, abide by what the state want to go. So it just showed you, if you're in a racist state, you at the mercy of their courts. Unless you have the monies and the abilities to take it to the federal court, Supreme Court. So it just showed you that once again how had to be how the governments worked in tandem and left you at bay. When it came down to be restrictive, and that's what's on page 85.
Absolutely, Brother T. And it says in response to the court's ruling, it says was massive resistance. So white folks went crazy when the Shelley decision came out, the Shelley case came out. So it says, but in the case of Shelley, the resistance came not so much from states as from federal agencies. So this was the Supreme Court, okay, saying that, look, we're going to repudiate our 1926 endorsement of restrictive covenants. And we acknowledge, that, the enforcement by state courts, this is unconstitutional, the Supreme Court. But the backlash came not from the states, Brother T. It says, but from federal agencies. So you had the FHA Commissioner Franklin D. Richards. He was like, it ain't going to affect our programs. We're going to keep it at business as usual. That's what he said. Right. Okay. I'm just paraphrasing, family. He just said, we're going to keep it, as business as usual. His exact words were, this decision would, in quotes, in no way affect the programs of this agency. So white folks were flat out saying, we don't care. We don't give a damn what the Supreme Court say. We're going to continue with business as usual. So then you had black people who did challenge it, right? It says, 6 months later, it says when Thurgood Marshall, then the NAACP, legal counsel, right? It said challenge the FHA policy of requiring restrictive covenants in deeds of the massive Levingtown development. And we discussed this, I believe this was last chapter, where there's like a suburb that was created. Remember, it was a black family that was actually hauling, remember, the materials, Brother T, back and forth from Levittown, and then when he put in the application, they was like, nope, you can't live here, right? So anyway, Thurgood Marshall and some, the NAACP legal counsel had challenged the FHA's policy of requiring restrictive covenants in the deeds of the massive Levittown development. Richards, who is the FHA commissioner, he responded by saying, I find nothing in the decision to indicate that in the absence of statutory authority, the government or any agency thereof is authorized to withdraw its normal protection and benefits from persons who have executed but do not seek judicial enforcement of such covenants. So he's saying basically, well, look, they didn't tell us, like, as long as this person isn't seeking, judicial enforcement of these
Right.
covenants, then, then we can continue doing our thing. We're not trying to, we don't want the courts to intervene in our business. We understand that the courts are now saying that this stuff is unconstitutional. So as long as the people aren't going to court and hoping that the court enforces the restrictive covenants, then we should be okay. And that's what he was basically saying, family.
Right.
So it says a year later, a year after the Shelley decision, it says Berkman's Fitzpatrick. There it is. Birchman Fitzpatrick, the chief counsel of the FHA's parent organization, the Housing Home Finance Agency, he revealed the contempt of federal officials for the ruling, right? Explaining
Mhm.
that owners for a particular neighborhood would no longer be deemed ineligible for FHA insurance on the basis of inhabitants' race. He stated that henceforth there must be some concrete objective set standards on which a writing down because of race is permitted.
Mm.
Okay. So he's saying there got to be some objective standards here. So they're saying, look, we may not be able to exclude you based on race, but we will set up some objective standards to make sure that we do exclude you based on your race, right? And so it says the FHA field staff understood perfectly what Fitzpatrick had in mind. So in 1948, a group of families had formed a cooperative to build build and occupy 60 homes in Lombard, Illinois, a suburb about 20 miles west of Chicago. It says, like the cooperative in Wallace Stegner had helped lead in Chicago, the Lombard group was racially inclusive, counting 2 African American families amongst its members, as did when beseeched by Stegner and his colleagues. The FHA refused to insure mortgages for the cooperative because of its refusal, right, to bar non-whites. So even after the Shelley decision, the FHA still made it mandatory,
Right.
still made restrictive covenants mandatory. So they totally disregarded it. And so in this paragraph, I have underlined, as Thurgood Marshall pointed out in a memo to President Truman. So President Truman was aware of this. It says allowing local and real estate markets to trump constitutional rights was no different from racial zoning ordinances found unconstitutional 20 years earlier, in which a vote of residents on a block could determine whether black families could move in. Let me pause here. Cynthia G is so disingenuous. And let me tell you why I'm bringing her up. Not,
Okay.
not, brother T, not to beef with the sister, or you get what I'm saying, or just to badmouth her, but disingenuous in spreading the propaganda that black men only fought after slavery. She said black men only fought for access to white women. And so last week she made a video about, the Lovington case, the Supreme Court versus
In
Loving.
Virginia.
And she made this video and she was like, see. So she's telling a lot of black women, even young black women, see, those black men, look at this. They only the white, even though it was a white guy. And she said the woman, I think the woman may have been mulatto, but considered black or something like that. But she was saying, but they black men think everybody black. But she was saying, look at this. Black men helped him win the case. And I don't know. I didn't read the court docs. That may have been the case that black men assisted, Loving with him winning, the case. But the point that I'm trying to make is that it's very disingenuous to tell black women that the only thing that black men ever fought for was access to white women. Because as you can see, We talked about Thurgood Marshall and the NAACP and these different people who were fighting the restrictive covenants, fighting to make sure that we can live wherever we wanted to live. Black men were fighting for that in this country. And so I just wanted to pause there and point that out. So at the bottom of page 87, it says on December the 2nd, 1949, a year and a half after the Shelley decision, U.S. Solicitor General Philip Perelman announced that the FHA could no longer insure mortgages with restrictive covenants, but he said the new policy could apply only to those executed after February the 15th, 1950, 2.5 months after his announcement and nearly 2 years after the Supreme Court's ruling. This delay could only have been designed to permit property owners to hurry up before the deadline to record to record restrictions where they hadn't previously existed. All right. And so they're saying, all right, after 1950, we cannot do it anymore. We cannot insure mortgages with restrictive covenants. So basically, he gave white folks enough time to clean up your stuff, in 2.5 months. Look, so put your restrictive stuff in there, and so we can continue, but after 1950, they couldn't do it anymore. And so it says, upon hearing the Solicitor's General's announcement, the FHA Executive Board, announced that it would ignore it. White folks, boy, man, these white folks, man, you talk about white privilege, man. White folks be like, man, the law. We know how black folks, we're law-abiding citizens for the most part. I know they always paint black people out to be criminals. They always paint us out to be criminals and to we break the law. But really, it's the opposite. Black folks, there's a lot of law-abiding. I know my mother is one of the most law-abiding citizens I know. Me, I'm a rebel. I didn't broke the law and been locked up. So I didn't, so me, brother T, I didn't broke the law, But my mother and the elders in my family, you talking about some law-abiding citizens. They say that I'm not gonna do it. You be the red light out there, nobody out. I'm not gonna run this red light. I'm trying to tell you, brother T. But white folks are flat out be like, nah, I'm not doing it. Nope. Even when I remember this police officer told me, white police officer told me years ago, he said, we don't mind coming into the black community and police. He said, man, I catch the most hell when we go out to the white communities. He said, they throw things at us, they fight us. It's the so black folks, as I know how we always F the police. No. When police officers patrol black communities, we don't really fool with the police, especially if the police not getting our business and we just doing our thing. Nobody really cares. He said when he goes into the white neighborhoods, he said they throw things at him when they try to lock somebody up in a white neighborhood. He said the white people, brother T, come outside and fight the white police officers. You get what I'm saying? Black folks, we don't do all of that. We don't do all of that. We the most law-abiding folks on the planet, boy. But the white folks flat out said, man, I don't even care what you're saying. Look at what it said at the top. It said the daggone executive, hold on. Upon hearing the Solicitor's General's announcement, the FHA Executive Board announced that it would ignore it, resolving that it should be made entirely clear that violation of the new ban on insuring mortgages with restricted covenants would not invalidate insurance. So white folks said, I'm ignoring it, right? So it goes on to say, the day at the Perelman's announcement, the FHA Commissioner Richards sent out a memo to all field officers emphasizing that they should continue to insure properties with new restrictive covenants that were not recorded with counties, but as he put it, were gentlemen agreements, and that the new policy would not apply to any FHA commitments for insurance that had already been made, nor to properties where applications were pending. He said, then to emphasize how much the agency opposed the spirit of the new rules, Richard's memo added that the agency will not attempt to control any owner in determining what tenants he shall have and to whom he shall sell his property. So the white folks flat out said, we're ignoring it. All right. So then it says when in February 1950 came, it says the FHA began its lackluster compliance with Shelley. It continued to ensure properties with covenants that were not explicitly racial. Instead, these agreements were designed to evade the court's intent by requiring neighbors or a community board to approve any sale. All right. So then it goes on to John F. Kennedy. You know, a lot of people love
Mm-hmm.
that daggone JFK. But you know what, brother T? I'm not familiar with JFK's policy. I don't know. I don't even know if how long. Can you tell me in the chat how long was JFK president? Because someone look that up for
Three
me, please.
years.
3 years.
He
So
passed. He got murdered. I mean,
yeah, so
assassinated.
yeah, so
3 years.
I'm not, you know how black folks love Roosevelt, and then you hear
Well, yeah.
yeah, you start hearing that a lot of the policies that he created actually harmed us and helped white folks. With John F. Kennedy, I don't know enough about his administration and look the policies that may have come out of that administration that may or may
But
not have.
Johnson.
Huh?
Yeah, the thing about Johnson was his vice president, so a lot of things came because they sat down and talked and met with MLK. So a lot of the things that JFK was trying to push, Johnson wound up signing off of because of his assassination.
And were these policies, brother T, that hurt or harm black folks?
Well, we got to look at what was signed. Like FHA laws, as you see right here, that he pushed a lot of the FHA loans. I mean laws. You got to look at what happens about education after the Johnson administration. A lot of the things with civil rights that we did receive came from administration. That's why blacks say he's one of the most respectful presidents that we had. Not Johnson, but basically JFK. A lot of people love, and also the allure of the Camelot. So it's, but policy wise, we still was screwed. But but a lot of the civil rights policies came from that administration. You want to say?
No, you said a lot of what, brother T?
A lot of the civil rights policies came from that administration.
From that administration. Oh, you saying Lyndon B. Johnson? It didn't click.
Yes.
Yeah, it
Yes,
just didn't
Johnson.
click when you said Johnson. Like it just didn't click. All right, okay, got you. I got you. So it says only in 1962, when President JFK issued an executive order prohibiting the use of federal funds to support racial discrimination in housing, did the FHA cease financing subdivision developments whose builders openly refused to sell to black buyers. All right, so he goes on. We're coming to the finish line, family. So it says, although the 1948 Shelley ruling forbade courts from ordering evictions, all right, it says parties to restrictive covenants continue for another 5 years to bring suits for damages against fellow signatories who violated their pacts. And 2 state Supreme Courts actually upheld the propriety of such damage award. It says one was the Supreme Court of Missouri, the state where Shelley case originated. It says the court took the position that the neighbors of a homeowner who violated a restrictive covenant could sue the seller for damages, even though they could no longer obtain a court order evicting the purchaser. So the black folks didn't have to get out, but the seller got sued. It says the other was the Oklahoma Supreme Court, which went a step further, finding that Shelley did not preclude neighbors from suing both the seller and purchaser for engaging in a conspiracy to diminish a community and community's property values. All right. So then it goes on to say in some cases, the FHA continued to ensure developments with racially explicit covenants that provided for violators to pay exorbitant damages rather than cancel the sales or evict African American residents. So this, brother T, was also a way of deterring owners from selling their property because they like, shoot, I don't feel like getting sued. I'm not trying to pay this exorbitant fee, And so again, this was a way to continue this stuff. So it goes on to say that in 1953, the Supreme Court ended this circumvention of Shelley It ruled that the 14th Amendment precluded state courts not only from evicting African Americans from homes purchased in defiance of restrictive covenants, but also from adjudicating suitors suits. I'm sorry, suits, adjudicating suits to recover damages from property owners who made such sales. Still, the court refused to declare that such private contracts were unlawful, or even the county clerks should be prohibited from accepting deeds that included in them. And then finally, Brother T,
19 years.
go ahead, Brother T, let's take us home.
All right, so it took another 19 years before the Federal Appeals Court ruled that the covenants themselves violated the Fair Housing Act. Okay, and that recording deeds with such clauses would constitute state action in violation of the 14th Amendment. After all this time, they want to get in unison. As we talked about earlier in this chapter, they made convicted on the federal, but they don't want to do it in the state. So after 19 years, the Federal Appeals Court ruled that the covenants themselves violated the Fair Housing Act, and the recording deeds with such clauses would constitute state action in violation of the 14th Amendment. Now they want to pull it up. So as the court observed, such provisions, even if they lack power, still would make black purchasers reluctant to buy into white neighborhoods if the recorded deeds gave implicit recognition of the racial prohibition and gave official imprimatur to the message that the purchaser should not live where they were not wanted. So the damage is already done. Blacks been, bruised by this. They're like, you know what? I don't even want to live in the neighborhood. I don't even want to go through the headache. So the job is done. It's just proved. I mean, remember in last chapter that Livingston, when he built this complex, he admitted that I'm 100% funded by the government. You know what I'm saying? And I'm gonna restrict, even though I'm being funded by the government, and even though I'm breaking the law. So this fight here, they fought tooth and nails. They wanted still to restrict, but yet still put African Americans out. So you see how like you said, against the law, these whites were. They didn't care that it was against the law. If it made sense to them, and if it made their initiative heard, they said we're gonna do what we want until we get fined or we're gonna get locked up ourselves. So this chapter was very eye-opening, Dr. Ma.
No doubt.
Absolutely amazing how when we see the cases, when we see the places, we see the faces, how they were so bold in their restriction. It should make it that much easier for us today to look at it. But I guarantee you, they still have some underlining deals, some gentleman deals they called it in this chapter, that they are still working and restricting and keeping us out of building.
Oh, absolutely. I'm looking up to see when the Fair Housing Act was passed. It was enacted, in 68. That's what I was looking for.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so
And what presidency was that? That was Johnson's, correct?
Yep, that was Johnson.
Mm-hmm.
Brother Shimsi put in the chat that, when Dr. King spoke out against the
Vietnam.
War, that Johnson, Lyndon B. Johnson was like, I can't,
Yeah,
I can't.
absolutely right.
Yeah, I can't fool with him. But family, I dropped the link in the chat if you want to come in and comment. We got about 8 minutes, to take if you want to come in and comment or add to the build. If not, man, join us back next week for chapter. What's this? Chapter 6, Brother T. Are we going into chapter 6?
Yes.
Chapter 6 is white flight. And I guarantee you, I haven't even read the chapter, brother T, but I guarantee you that he's going to talk about how white people are incentivized to leave. They're literally trained. Not only are they incentivized, but they have been conditioned to say, up, black folks are moving in, we're moving out. It's time to go. the neighborhood is going is going. That's what's happening. You know, that's what's happening. Like the Owens Mills, and
Yes.
I saw white flight happening in the 80s and didn't know what was going on.
Going on.
All
That's
I
right.
know is because so my father and mom, they purchased a home in the suburbs, which is in Woodlawn. But Woodlawn is, if you
Mhm.
notice, brother T, is right beside the city. So
Right.
you ain't deep in the suburbs. You just maybe 5 miles into the county. You know what I
Yep.
mean? But you're right there next to Emerson Village. You know, you're right there. You keep on
Right.
driving down Cooks Lane, now you're in Woodlawn, right? Literally.
Yep.
Okay. And so Woodlawn was like that suburb that was right outside the city. Okay. And so initially Woodlawn was all white. I remember looking at my brother, peace be upon his soul. He transitioned in 1993, where he was an 11-year age difference. Okay, so I was
Mm.
12, he was 23 when he passed. But I remember looking at some of his old school pictures, and he attended the same elementary school that I went to, which was Featherbed Lane Elementary School. And that school he was the only black face. He was the
Mm.
only black face, in the picture. And so at one point, Woodlawn was predominantly black, and there were two black families on our block, my family and the family down the street. All right. And those were the people I used to play with. And so I remember there were white neighbors to my left, to my right, and in front of me. By the
Mm.
time I got to high school, brother T, the whole neighborhood was black. So literally within a 10-year span, I
Yep.
remember when I'm like, daggone, Mr. Frank, who used to dress up as Santa Claus, he gone. He had some sons, Donnie and them, they gone. Then the white neighbors over here, they left. Then over here, these white neighbors left. I didn't know, Brother T, that I was witnessing white flight, but
Right.
that's what happened. These white folks was like, man, there's too many black folks on this block, man. We got to get out of
Mm-hmm.
here. And that's what they did. So peace be upon. Look at Shimsu Netches in the building. Peace, beloved. How are you?
Peace, sister. We had the same issue in Highland Park, Michigan. Highland Park was where the executives for General Motors used to stay.
Mm.
If you look at Highland Park, you got these big, like almost looks like mansions, beautiful brick homes.
Hmm.
When blacks start moving in that area, the entire area of Highland Park is black now. Now I support that. If they want to separate and they want to leave, they can go. Now the problem is segregation.
Come
That
on.
means is they're suppressing our ability to have power and empowering themselves.
That's
They're
right.
suppressing ours. That's what the segregation is. But separation, I'm for that. If they want to, when we move into nice neighborhoods and they want to leave, but the problem is for us to begin to take advantage of that with some black power.
Come on.
That's what
Come
needs to
on.
happen. Yep.
Come on, brother Simshu. And I love how you broke down the difference between separation and segregation. You're saying if you
Brilliant.
separate, fine, but then don't have us, don't segregate us.
Right.
Meaning, brother Simshu, like you just said, that we have no political control over our communities.
Detroit could have been a haven for black people, but when the leadership got in power, they began to become individualistic. After the grassroots, after Coleman Young got in power, the political infrastructure got corrupted. If at one time Detroit was 90% black, look what kind of voting power that gives you. Look what kind of
Mm,
political power and clout what a 90% black city could do with conscious
mm,
people. With conscious people,
mm.
that could have been something.
And so you're saying now it's not predominantly black.
Well, it's 80% black. It's still black, but the politicians appeal to the gentrification that's happening to the downtown Detroit.
And
So
that's what they
white people do that. They will finance blacks who will have their interest. That's what they do. When they move into your city, that's how they undermine you. You can have a black face, but they got white interests.
mm.
Yeah.
And I remember you were saying, I remember, and I just wanted to kind of rehash that discussion, Brother Simsu, because thinking about Detroit. Didn't you say Dr. Claude Anderson? I just want you to share with this new audience. And you said Dr. Claude Anderson was trying to do some work in Detroit and they ran him out of there, right?
Right. Well, we had a proposal of African Town. So you got Greek Town in Detroit that they have their is businesses, entertainment, where they have their own thing. And for years, people go down there and they have their restaurants and things like that where they empower themselves. So blacks got together and created something that was called African Town. That was going to be a black hub, far as with entertainment, businesses, and things of that sort. So the Jews, of course, came against it because they own most of the real estate in Detroit. The Koreans came against it, and blacks came against. Claude Anderson was part of the development program that was going to launch that. The African Town, and they ran Claude political. Well, those weren't really blacks because all skin folk and kin folks, you know that.
That's
But
right.
but they were blacks that were paid by the Koreans and Jews in the community to come against people like Dr. Claude Anderson. That's the way white people work. They know they can't beat us voting politically. Not an 80% city, but what they can do is bankroll black politicians and put them in key positions to have the interest. That's how they do that.
Absolutely. I just wanted to bring that out. I remember you talked about that during Blueprint for Black Power.
Oh yeah.
You know, Brother Simpson, you gotta get back on this panel. We miss you, man. I know you. Come on, we miss you, Brother Simpson. You
definitely got to get back. I definitely got to get back. Yes, indeed.
We're gonna read. After this, we plan on reading Dr. William Darity's book. Was Darity on? I'm looking at it right now. Where is it? From here to equality.
Let me find that.
From here to equality, Dr. Darity book. That's gonna be next. From here to equality. Yeah,
I'm about to sit in on that one.
Yeah, so we want you to come on back, Brother Shamsu.
Absolutely.
And drop those jewels, because you I just appreciate your patience with us doing the book club, because we would, oh man, Booker T Washington, my guy. And then I forgot who was on the panel with us, but you were going back and forth with them about W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Yeah. And so I forgot who it was.
Right, and I do love W.E.B. Du Bois, but we got to see they do the same thing with Cornel West. Cornel West is not a black leader. He's a scholar and a college professor. They're trying to make him like a Farrakhan or a Malcolm. That's not his lane. You put Dr. Cornel West in a classroom with students, he's a star. That's why these white schools go out and pay him hundreds of thousands of dollars to keep him out of black schools. You know, he's in high demand as a college professor. I don't expect Du Bois never had the charisma of a Marcus Garvey. You don't have to be a scholar to be a leader. You have to have charisma and showmanship. That wasn't Du Bois' strength. He was a researcher and an intellectual. He didn't have the charisma to be no international leader like Mr. Garvey. Yeah, that's
got you. Yeah, but I remember you kept saying
That's a good point.
That is a really good point. You kept saying Booker T's my guy. I remember you kept saying that, and we couldn't understand it. You know,
the basic tools of nationalism. Think about plumbing. The bricks that went into building Tuskegee was built by students. The first structures that was constructed by Tuskegee was built by students. Drafting. They were making clothes, shoes. You had George Washington Carver there, of course. So you had the agricultural aspect and inventions. Every tool that you needed to be self-sufficient, Booker T. Washington put in place.
Absolutely. And peace be upon him. Peace be upon him. Yeah. Peace be upon him. So, all right, I don't have anything left. I think that we nailed it. How did you enjoy the discussion, Brother Shamsu?
I loved it. Incredible book. This is an incredible read. It just shows you how white supremacy is on remote control. It doesn't really matter who runs it because it's a template. That you can learn what they do is absolutely like Barack Obama being president. Everything's in place as a system, so it doesn't really. All they have to do is manage it, and white supremacy will continue to function as white supremacy.
Oh, say that again. Say that again.
Everything is in place as a system. All people have to do is maintain the system of white supremacy. It's on remote control. Absolutely.
That's why it doesn't matter what faces in the places.
That's right.
They're maintaining the system.
The system. The system maintains itself. So you don't really need somebody. If you're that's what revolutionaries, they get rid of them real quick because they want to interrupt the system. That's what a revolutionary does. So, but as a politician, whoever is black or white, it doesn't really matter what color they are, as long as they maintain the system.
Ashe. And
Mm.
you wouldn't be in those positions if you didn't
No.
work to maintain the system. They wouldn't
That's
even
right.
put you there
That's
in the
right.
first place. They
That's
wouldn't
right.
even put you there in the first place. Ashe. All right, family. Join us back here at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time next Sunday for Chapter 6, White Flight.
That's right.
White Flight, Chapter 6. And I'll be live this Tuesday, either with Brother Onk or Professor James Small. So I'll be live with somebody this Tuesday at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And if I don't see you on Tuesday and Thursday, have a black-tastic week.
Pop-
Peace.